Hello, YouTube. This is Delusional Bodlacanian. I will be reading Vivek Chibber's The Class Matrix from Consent to Resignation, Chapter 3.5. The argument from cultural hegemony is, as we have seen, questionable on two grounds. First, in its supposition that an improvement along one dimension of working class experience can neutralize the perception of harms along others. Second, in its refusal to countenance the possibility that consent might substantially diminish without the system falling into crisis. Together, these factors cast serious doubt about the argument, even in its materialist version. A theory of capitalist stability cannot take consent to be the bedrock upon which it rests. A more plausible explanation for capitalism's political stability locates it not in the working class embracing its situation, but in resigning itself to it. That is, workers accept their location in the class structure because they see no other viable option. Consent would be crucial as the anchor for political stability if, at all times, workers had a viable exit option. If they had the freedom to opt out of capitalism, eliciting their consent to the current system would be the only reliable mechanism for maintaining it. There are two ways they might choose to exit the system. The first is if they have the ability to leave the labor market. If every employee could freely choose between work and non-work, employment contracts would have to be changed to better reflect their interests, rather than favoring the interests of employers. This would, in turn, allow that if they chose to work, it would be because they wanted to, not because they had to. But as I argued in Chapter 1, the actual inducement to work comes from the fact that workers, in fact, do not have the option of choosing non-work. They participate in wage labor, not because they see it as an intrinsically desirable social relation, but because their structural situation compels them to sell their labor power. The second way workers might opt out is via the route predicted by Marx and his early followers, changing the system through collective action. But as I argued in Chapter 2, this argument drastically underestimates the obstacles to class formation. Capitalism not only distributes productive assets unequally, but in consequences also generates an unequal distribution of class capacities. At the heart of the asymmetry is the fact that workers have to organize themselves to advance their interests, while a capitalist can typically advance his interests without having to coordinate with his peers. This, of course, places all the normal burdens of collective action on workers, burdens that early Marxists never adequately theorized. And on the other side, their class rivals are relieved of that very responsibility, since the typical capitalist is able to protect his interests in his relation with his employees without having to organize with other capitalists. But equally, since he does not have to expend his resources on forging class organizations, the capitalist has the freedom to expend them on preventing or breaking up the organizations built by his employees, if they manage to cobble them together at all. So workers are disadvantaged in the political contest on two distinct levels, facing greater obstacles to collective action, ceteris paribus, and on top of that, having to defend against the disruptive strategies of their employers, which heaps on an additional layer of difficulties. Hence, I concluded in Chapter 2, workers will rationally choose an individualized mode of resistance over a collective role, if they resist at all. They can only begin to wage class struggle when they manage to overcome the obstacles to collective action. This is to say that workers do not have a viable exit option in the normal course of events. They can neither opt out of their structural location nor overthrow it as and when they desire. They consent to capitalism because they see no other option as a means of sustaining themselves. Hence, the dominant class does not have to depend on workers' active consent to the system. Of course, they will benefit from it if it is forthcoming. A class that manages to increase the incidence of consent within the working population will be more secure in its dominance. But this is not the foundation for the system's reproduction. The more fundamental mechanism, the one that remains in place even when consent breaks down and keeps workers coming back to their job every day, and thereby reproducing the system, is what Marx called the dull compulsion of economic relations. This does not mean worker class consent plays no role in the reproduction of capitalism. It suggests that its spread within the class is always ephemeral because it is linked to conditions that are themselves unstable. In periods of steady growth, in which there are also mechanisms that translate productivity increases into income gains, there will be a greater spread of active consent to the system. This is something like what occurred in the decades immediately after World War II, when capitalism experienced its most rapid growth, and on its back, so did working class incomes. This was the era of consent, if ever there was one. But with the onset of slower growth and wage stagnation, which was in its full swing by the 1980s, capitalism entered a new era. The institutions that had enabled a political exchange between labor and capital were slowly dismantled, and the income gains from the production went overwhelmingly to capitalists and managers. In this period, it was neither consent nor coercion that maintained the status quo, but the overwhelming pressure imposed on the general population of economic survival. There is a rich literature now on the culture of neoliberalism, the atomization, the sense of helplessness, the erosion of social bonds, the retreat inward. All of these were symptoms of the same underlying condition, namely that the source for social stability had shifted powerfully toward resignation. Hence, a high-growth capitalism will have a greater degree of consent within the working class than a low-growth one, and a capitalism with a working class efficiently organized to effectuate a political exchange with employers will have a greater propensity for consensus than one in which it is unorganized. And one will neither fail, and one with neither will fall back on resignation alone. When the class is organized, then the normal sources of consent break down, and the feeling of resignation is overcome. The Marxian scenario of a revolutionary transition becomes a political opinion. Stability is thus governed by the interaction of economic growth and political organization. Figure 3.1 summarizes the possible outcomes. It bears mentioning that boxes 1 and 2 should be read as consent overlaid atop to resignation. It is not that consent ever displaces resignation altogether with the laboring classes, rather its incidence increases. This argument flows from my observation in section 3.4 that the improvement of material conditions along one dimension of the employment relation cannot be assumed to ameliorate the harms generated in the other dimensions. This means that there is a baseline level of resentment that workers harbor toward their situation, springing from the class relation itself, which neither Gramscian consent nor the more ambitious kind described by Pravorsky can dissolve. The primary source for the participation in wage labor remains the dull compulsion of economic relations. What changes is the degree to which this compulsion operates as a motivator. The preceding account of capitalist stability differs from Gramsci's in that it shifts the explanation from consent to resignation. It is worth mentioning that Gramsci was certainly aware of the phenomenon. He explains in the notebooks that crises sometimes can be averted when the status quo is losing legitimacy, but that the masses have either acquired the habits and customs necessary for the new systems of living and working, or else they continue to be subject to coercive pressure through the elementary necessities of their existence. The reliance of habits and customs formed among the masses from the mundane necessities of their existence seems to be a gesture toward what I have described as resignation. Gramsci does seem to be alluding to the possibility of the dominant class's reliance of this phenomenon as a source of stability rather than on consent, pure and simple. But while it makes an appearance, it remains peripheral to his broader political sociology. It is never integrated into his explanation for class dominance. So that was chapter 3.5 of Vivek Chibber. I kind of popped in on Vivek's debate with Zizek and learned a lot about him and slowly enjoying his book and trying to get into the practice of reading more things out loud and trying to improve my vocabulary. And I am also trying to understand half of what I'm reading, to be quite honest. But this working class organization and economic growth, possible outcomes has sort of interested me, and I will be deep diving that more further as I read